The most powerful navy in human history was 40 miles away. Iran seized the ship anyway. What did Iran know about the U.S. Navy's rules of engagement that made 40 miles feel like 400? This was not a miscalculation. It was not a provocation in the conventional sense, a reckless act by a desperate regime testing boundaries it doesn't understand. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz in the early hours of this week was the operational execution of a decision made at the highest levels of Iranian strategic planning. At a moment chosen with precision against a target selected for maximum legal ambiguity, in a corridor where the world's most powerful military was present and chose or was forced to watch. The gap between those two things, between chose and was forced, is where the entire story lies. What did Iran know about the U.S. Navy's rules of engagement that made 40 miles feel like 400? And which American ally privately told Washington it would not support a military response before the seizure even happened? Here is the board. The USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group was operating in the Gulf of Oman 40 nautical miles from the Hormuz navigation channel at the time of the seizure. It carries 2,500 Marines, F-35B strike aircraft, and enough firepower to reduce the URG fast attack fleet to wreckage inside 90 minutes. 40 miles. That is not a distance that poses a response problem for a force of that capability. A U.S. Navy helicopter can cover 40 miles in 12 minutes. A naval gunfire solution can be computed and executed in less than 4. The Bataan Group had real-time awareness of the seizure as it happened, confirmed by subsequent Pentagon statements that carefully avoided explaining why the awareness produced no response. That careful avoidance is the first signal. The second is what Iran did with the crew after it had the ship. Remember the crew, because their treatment is not a humanitarian footnote. It is a strategic communication. To understand the seizure, you need to understand the 18 months that preceded it, not the headline events, the drone strikes, the carrier deployments, the coalition withdrawals, the operational groundwork, the specific patient, methodical preparation that transformed a maritime choke point from a geography of confrontation into a mechanism of control. Iran's URG Navy has conducted 22 vessel interceptions in Gulf waters since January of last year. Not all seizures, not all publicized. Some were boarding inspections that ended with vessels released after hours. Some were diversions to Iranian ports that lasted days before quiet diplomatic resolution. Some were surveillance contacts, SURG fast attack craft approaching commercial vessels, conducting visual inspections, filming the vessel and its crew, and departing without boarding. Each one produced something: data, procedures, response times, rules of engagement, boundaries. 22 interceptions in 18 months. That is not an escalation pattern. That is a training program. And the vessel seized this week was not the 23rd random target in a series of opportunistic harassment operations. It was the graduation exercise. Think about what 22 interceptions teaches you. It teaches you exactly how close an URG fast attack craft can approach a commercial vessel before the nearest US naval asset changes its operational posture. It teaches you the radio frequencies used for distress calls and the response protocols that follow. It teaches you which vessel profiles, flag state, cargo type, ownership structure, insurance arrangement generate the most ambiguous legal situation when detained. It teaches you, in other words, precisely where the edges of American response are, not the edges as written in doctrine, the edges as practiced in real conditions against real vessels with real US naval assets present and observing. The vessel seized this week, the MV Atlantic Navigator II, a Marshall Islands flagged bulk carrier operating under a charter arrangement that connects it, through 3 corporate layers, to a subsidiary of a company that appears on the U.S. Treasury's OFAC sanctions list, fits a profile that Iran has been refining across all 22. Prior interceptions, maximum legal ambiguity, 3 corporate layers between the vessel and the sanctioned entity, a flag state, Marshall Islands, whose maritime registry is administered by a U.S.-based company, creating a jurisdictional complication that Iran's legal team identified and exploited, a cargo, refined petroleum products, whose end destination involves a port facility with documented connections to sanctions-listed entities. Every element of that profile was selected. None of it was coincidental. 3 corporate layers selected deliberately. The URG boarding team arrived at 0420 local time, 6 fast attack craft, 41 personnel. The approach was conducted in near darkness. From the vessel's port quarter, the blind spot created by the bridge's sightline obstruction at that angle, at a speed that brought the lead craft alongside before the watch officer Completed his first distress transmission, 41 personnel for a crew of 22, almost 2 to 1. That ratio is not about control. A crew of 22 does not require 41 armed personnel to control. That ratio is about speed, about having enough people to simultaneously secure the bridge, the engine room, the communications, equipment, and the crew quarters in a single coordinated movement that prevents any individual action that could complicate the boarding before it is complete. The Bataan Group's response decision. This is the question that the Pentagon's careful language has been constructed to obscure and that the available evidence allows us to partially reconstruct. At 04233 minutes after the boarding commenced, the Atlantic Navigator 2 transmitted a distress signal on Channel 16. The International Maritime Distress Frequency, monitored continuously by all naval vessels in the region. The signal was received. It was received by the Bataan Group. It was received by a British Royal Navy vessel operating 67 miles to the south. It was received by a Way Coast Guard relay station at Fujairah, 3 separate receiving entities, 3 separate response calculations. All 3 reached the same conclusion within approximately 4 minutes. None of them moved toward the Atlantic Navigator 2. None of them moved. Let that register. A Marshall Islands flagged vessel, crewed by 22 nationals of Philippines, India, and Pakistan, transmitting a distress signal in one of the world's most monitored maritime corridors, with 3 naval or Coast Guard entities within response range, and not one of them moved to intervene. That is not a coordination failure, that is a coordinated decision, and the coordination happened before the seizure, not after it. The American ally that told Washington it would not support a military response told Washington that in a communication that preceded the seizure by at least 72 hours, which means Washington knew that if Iran moved, the response coalition would not hold, knew that a unilateral American military intervention to recover a Marshall Islands flagged vessel connected through 3 corporate layers to a sanctioned entity would stand alone, diplomatically, in a way that 3 carrier groups cannot compensate for, alone, the word that moves fleets or stops them. Iran knew it too. This is the depth of the intelligence picture that preceded the boarding, not just the vessel's legal profile and the response time data from 22 prior interceptions. Iran had access through sources and methods that remain unconfirmed but whose existence is implied by the precision of the timing to the diplomatic communication that established the response coalition would not hold. That communication or its substance informed the decision to execute on this vessel, on this night, at this moment. The 4:20 timing was not chosen for operational concealment alone. It was chosen because 0420 local time corresponds to a specific shift change in the 5th Fleet's watch rotation at Manama, a rotation pattern that Iran's barge intelligence program spent 36 months mapping. The watch change creates a 7-minute administrative window in the command response cycle. The boarding was complete in 6. Here is what Iran's real objective was, and it is not the ship. The Atlantic Navigator 2 is worth approximately $45 million. Its cargo, 67,000 metric tons of refined petroleum products, is worth approximately $38 million at current market prices. Neither figure is strategically meaningful to a nation managing a $400 billion economy under sanctions. Iran did not seize the Atlantic Navigator 2 for its cargo value, its ransom potential, or even its symbolic value as a demonstration of maritime capability. Iran seized it for what happens next, specifically for the negotiation that the seizure forces and the precedent that negotiation establishes regardless of its outcome. If Washington negotiates for the vessel's release, it implicitly acknowledges that Iran has a detainable interest in vessels connected to sanctioned entities transiting the strait, which validates the legal framework Iran has been constructing for 3 years. If Washington refuses to negotiate and recovers the vessel by force, it commits an act of war against Iranian-controlled waters that breaks the escalation management that every U.S. Gulf policy for the last 2 years has been designed to maintain. If Washington does nothing, the option the Bataan Group's non-response suggests is currently operative. The vessel sits in Bandar Abbas, the crew sits in Iranian custody, and every shipping company, every insurer, every flag state registry in the world updates its risk calculus for Hormuz transit accordingly. Every shipping company, every insurer, every flag state updating simultaneously, because they are watching what happens to the Atlantic Navigator 2 and drawing the only rational conclusion available. The United States Navy was 40 miles away, and the ship was taken anyway. Insurance premiums for Hormuz transit have already moved. In the 48 hours since the seizure, war risk premiums for vessels transiting the navigation channel have increased by 340%, not percent points, 340%. That premium increase is not a market reaction to a single incident, it is a market repricing of a structural reality that the security guarantee that made Hormuz transit insurable at previous rates no longer exists in its previous form. The crew treatment. Remember the crew. The instruction from the opening of this account. 22 crew members, Filipino, Indian, and Pakistani nationals. They have been provided with food, medical care, communication access to their families, and accommodation that multiple maritime welfare organizations with contact to the crew have described as significantly better than the conditions provided to crews in previous seizures. The improvement is not humanitarian impulse. It is strategic calculation of a specific and precise kind. Iran needs this seizure to remain in a legal gray zone to be readable as a customs enforcement action rather than a hostage situation. A hostage situation triggers a different set of international legal obligations, a different set of domestic political pressures in the crew's home countries, and a different set of US response options. Comfortable crew members in regular contact with their families are not hostages under any international legal definition. They are detainees pending resolution of a customs matter. The legal distinction is everything. Iran's lawyers understood that before the boarding team stepped onto the accommodation ladder. Philippines, India, and Pakistan, three nations whose governments have been specifically targeted by Iran's diplomatic outreach over the last 18 months. Three nations with significant labor diaspora populations working in Gulf states whose economic stability is directly connected to energy corridor security. Three nations that cannot politically support a military response that puts their nationals at increased risk. The crew composition of the Atlantic Navigator II was in Iran's possession before the seizure. The crew manifest is part of a vessel's required pre-arrival documentation, transmitted digitally, accessible through maritime information. Systems that Iran's intelligence apparatus has demonstrated the ability to monitor. Iran knew the crew was Filipino, Indian, and Pakistani before the first fast attack craft left port. Here is the full strategic architecture assembled. Iran selected a vessel with maximum legal ambiguity 3 corporate layers to a sanctioned entity, Marshall Islands flag with US-administered registry, petroleum cargo with sanctioned end connection. It chose a moment coordinated with a watch rotation gap at 5th Fleet Command. Preceded by diplomatic confirmation that the response coalition would not hold, time to the Bataan Group's operational posture that made intervention legally and diplomatically costlier than non-intervention. It crewed the boarding team at a ratio designed for speed rather than control. It treated the crew in a manner that keeps the incident in customs enforcement legal territory rather than hostage crisis legal territory, and it did all of this 40 miles from the most powerful amphibious ready group in the world, not despite the Bataan Group's presence, because of it. Because having the Bataan Group 40 miles away and choosing not to intervene is a more powerful demonstration of Iran's strategic position than conducting the seizure in its absence. The Bataan Group's non-response is the message to every shipping company repricing Hormuz transit risk, to every flag state registry updating its guidance to vessel operators, to every nation currently deciding whether Iran's bilateral maritime framework, the one that let Chinese and Russian tankers transit freely on the same night. The Seizure Star was stopped last month, is worth joining. The message is this: the United States Navy was here, we knew it was here, we moved anyway, and nothing happened. That message, transmitted not by Iranian state media but by the physical reality of the Atlantic Navigator II sitting in Bandar Abbas Harbor while the Bataan Group conducts scheduled operations 40 miles south, is worth more to Iran's strategic position than any missile strike, any drone swarm, any mine activation could produce. Here's the full picture. The Atlantic Navigator II was not seized because Iran got lucky or bold or reckless. It was seized because Iran spent 18 months and 22 interceptions learning exactly where the edges of American response are, because Iran's diplomatic operation established 72 hours before the boarding team left port that the response coalition would not hold, because the vessel's legal profile was selected from a refined template that maximizes detention legitimacy and minimizes military response trigger, because the crew composition was confirmed in advance to include nationals of 3 countries whose governments cannot support military Escalation, because the watch rotation gap at Fifth Fleet was mapped through a barge intelligence program that cost $3 million per quarter to run, and because the Bataan Group's non-response was not a failure, it was a correct calculation, under the constraints that Iran's multi-year strategic operation had constructed around it. What did Iran know about the U.S. Navy's rules of engagement that made 40 miles feel like 400? It knew that rules of engagement are not written for legal ambiguity. They are written for clarity for situations where the hostile intent is unambiguous, the legal status of the target is clear, and the diplomatic cost of response is calculable. Iran engineered a situation where none of those conditions existed. The rules of engagement didn't fail. They functioned exactly as written, against a situation specifically designed to fall outside their application. Which leaves the second loop still open: the American ally that told Washington it would not support a military response before the seizure happened. That ally is not a minor partner. It is a nation whose geographic position, whose energy infrastructure, and whose bilateral relationships with both Washington and Tehran make its neutrality, in this moment, not merely diplomatically significant but operationally decisive. Its identity and the specific communication it sent to Washington in the 72 hours before the Atlantic Navigator 2 was boarded connects this seizure to a broader realignment that is happening faster than any public reporting has captured. That realignment, and what it means for the next vessel Iran selects, is where this story goes next.